Hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. I'm Daniel Bryant, News Manager here at InfoQ and Director of DevRel at Ambassador Labs. And I recently had the pleasure of sitting down with Mario Platt, VP Head of Information Security at CloudMargin. I met Mario on a recent SneakCon security panel that I hosted on the topic of platform security, and I thoroughly enjoyed our chat. It was instantly clear that Mario has a lot of experience in this space and has done a lot of thinking about the socio-technical aspects of security. In this podcast, I was keen to dive into topics such as the emergence of DevSecOps and explore how this differs from the classic DevOps approach. I was also keen to understand how developers and platform teams can work together to design and build secure systems and explore how threat modeling can be used in this context. Hello, Mario, and welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Could you introduce yourself for the listeners, please?
My name is Mario Platt. I got interested in security when I was only 13 back in 1998 with hacking, as you do. That's how you get teenagers to like security, right? And I've been working in the field since 2002. So I have a lot of background experience in infrastructure, so managing Windows servers, Linux, etc. And I have over 10 years of security engineering and operations. My first full-time security role was a penetration tester as well. And for the past 7 to 8 years, I've been more focusing on governance, risk, and compliance. But I wanted to make sure that I didn't lose my technical know-how. So I still do a lot of technical stuff. So I like to think of myself and consider myself a full-stack security person. Since I'm sometimes sitting down with the teams, the technical teams, actually reviewing code and implementing controls in CI/CD pipelines. And in the same day, I'm talking with the board about our next 3-year plan. And lately, I've also created a new course, so a Certified DevSecOps for Leaders course through Practical DevSecOps. And that is one of the things that are applying a lot of DevOps concepts to how we manage security and how to manage security within DevOps environments.
Super. And that's a perfect lead, actually, into my next question, Mario. So you and I were actually on a panel at SneakCon a while back. So, I've talked about this before, but you mentioned there DevSecOps. Now, when I first heard this, I wasn't super convinced. I was like, DevOps surely needs security. But I know you've got some really interesting thoughts about that. Could you expand on that for us, please?
Generally, there are two schools of thought with regards to the word DevSecOps. There are some people that like it, some people that don't. And I think they're both right. So what I think is we need to contextualize the word to the environment that we're trying to influence or to the environment that we are operating in. So for organizations that have a good quality assurance approach to the way they build their products and services, then the introduction of DevSecOps makes, in my opinion, less sense. Right? Because you've got an overall approach to how you manage quality throughout your product, and extending that to include how you approach security is easy and simple. Right? So you can leverage all of the quality assurance related processes that you may have internally to do security. Right? And the people that are against the word DevSecOps, usually that's the angle that they come from. This should all be part of what we call product quality, and this should be integrated into the way we operate. And they're right. On the other hand, you also have organizations that are not so good from an overall quality assurance perspective. They have low code coverage across their code. They don't have mature practices in how they identify bugs and treat them, and are kind of always chasing features with a lot of tech that they're not managing. You're always going to have it, right? But they're not managing it proactively. For those types of organizations, particularly when you have security teams that are used to the old model of securing things on-prem, then that comes with a problem that if you don't call it a name, you really can't do much about it. Right? So DevSecOps, I think, is most useful to help old world security teams, so teams that are used to old ways of working, securing on-prem with waterfall type methods, etc., in helping them make the transition into considering what security in DevOps should look like. And because there's such a rich body of knowledge using the word DevSecOps, it's a way to introduce the conversation, and it's a way for people to be able to have a conversation about it. But from that point of view, I think it makes it useful as a transition mechanism, knowing that at some point in your maturity curve, you may want to stop calling it something different, because that then may affect agency and ownership from the front lines, right? Our digital front lines, all developers. We want them to have agency over security, want them to own it. At some point in your journey, calling it something different becomes detrimental to that sense of ownership. Right? If they see it as integral part of their role identity, then they're more likely to take ownership, to have agency, and all those good things.
I'm really interested in building platforms. I know you are too. And for me, there's a lot of friction between dev and ops in the platform space. The platform or the ops folks own the platform, and developers want to use self-service mechanisms to get their code out in front of users. What's your experience of good boundaries, integration points, or maybe even common areas of friction where dev and ops meet on the platform?
That comes back into, particularly from a security point of view, right? So I like to think of integrating security in DevOps from the point of view of the practices. So we're going to have some practices where we will be identifying the things that we need to do. And we're going to have some practices which are supported by tooling in the sense of integrating security controls from a CI/CD perspective. So for instance, every time I make a deploy, we're using Open Policy Agent to check the hardening of our Nginx config, right? For instance, that type of stuff. So I think that's where those kind of boundaries or points of friction may happen, right? Where we can leverage them to better serve the whole. So, for instance, a platform team main aim should be to reduce the cognitive load required from the teams that are developing the applications. So what I mean by that is the development of patterns that the teams can use. Look, here's a Docker image that you can use to deploy your software. You don't need to know how it works. You just need to know that it's in the artifact and it's here and it's ready for you to use and deploy your code on. So from that perspective, things that are more horizontal to the organization. So let's say we've got a team, everyone uses JavaScript and Go. So from that perspective, it doesn't make much sense from a security point of view to be individually developing with all of the development teams individual checks and telling them how they can integrate checks into their CI/CD pipelines. It makes more sense both economically and from an expertise perspective just to work with your platform team to integrate that as part of the platform itself. So things that are very specific to a particular team in the way they operate or the product that they develop, things that are very specific should be within their realm, right? So the practices such as threat modeling, etc., is always a practice that I think should be across the board in all development and platform teams. From the point of view of not only being efficient, but people understanding what it is that security means to them. And that's, I think, a word that is kind of thrown a lot in security, that security is everyone's job, but a few people can actually tell you what that means.
Yes, a good point.
The thing is, when I come in the morning, a developer logs onto the laptop at 9 a.m., what does security is my job mean to me in the context of the things that I'm developing? And that is where having an approach whereby we stop thinking so much in terms of static, and that's a problem that in team topologies is also addressed a lot, which is stop thinking about team topologies from a security perspective as something static. So you report to the security engineering manager or to the CISO and you do all your job from within the constraint, the organizational hierarchy. We need to start thinking more of that team is in need of help. Let me join their team for 3 sprints. Let me work with them on the things that they need to do, and then you move on, right? You disseminate the knowledge. You teach people how to perform threat modeling, how to interpret the output of some of the security tooling that you've worked with a platform team to integrate into their CI/CD platform. And then you know you've got enough critical mass of knowledge that the teams can then do it by themselves. But if we just think of you come in and every 2 months we're going to do a workshop where we're going to go through this, it's not going to work, right? You're not going to build the organizational relationships that will make you effective in the informal network, which is my opinion from a security perspective, is usually real security happens more on the informal network than it does on the formal one.
Yes, good point. So you mentioned a couple of times there team topologies. I know you and I are both big fans of Matthew Manuel's work, and we both know him quite well, which is good. Would you recommend to organizations to understand like the team topologies? And then the book obviously breaks down a lot of interaction models and the way teams and organizations should be structured. But would you recommend organizations get that down first and then look at security? Or is it security first, or is it a mix of the two? Like if folks are new to both these concepts, how to go about bringing it into their organization?
It would be helpful if it happened at the same time, so that once people understand how these better ways of working, how these more integrated models that care for cognitive load, they care for people's actual work and the practices that lead to deploying X times a day, etc., and make everyone efficient. It would be great if the organizational design was seen as a whole. But experience tells me that probably never happened. Mainly because it's not just something that I think is specific to security. It's about the areas of the organization that work in multi-year cycles mainly. Right. So InfoSec is one of them. Finance is another one. When you have dedicated service management or sales, that's another one. It's more about the feedback loops and how people get observability from the actions that they perform. And the truth is, most CISOs, they may say they're working in an agile way, but they're not, right? They're still thinking about 2, 3 years down the line. They're not thinking about how can I make the now better. They are thinking, I've got these compliance standards that I'd like to align or to achieve in the next 3 to 4 years. And this is my 3-year roadmap on how I'm going to get there, which is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is that you lose the opportunities to learn, you lose the opportunities to listen, and you lose the opportunities potentially to adapt to how your organizations is evolving from the point of view of ownership of security, from the point of view of the types of solutions that you do. So overall, and this is something that in the safety science, in the safety space is much more advanced than it is in cybersecurity, but I think we're going to get there at some point, which is the difference between a model of centralized control to a model of guided adaptability. Usually the problem there is that typical security teams tend to be too detached from the day-to-day development of their products and services, and they're so detached that they don't actually understand the work that people do. They don't understand the pressures, what is possible to do on the environment, the affordances provided by the tools, by the management pressures, by all of those things that constrain how a developer develops code, right? The types of pressures they feel on a daily basis, because we tend to think we just need to deploy that control because that's what makes us secure. We need to deploy that technology because that's what we does. We lose sight of the variability into a developer's daily work. And when we fail in our processes and in policies to account for that variability that is both responsible for the success of the organization, but also sometimes responsible for the failures in the incidents that we have, that variability is there, right? We need to learn how to deal with it. It's not going to go away just because we wrote a process. It just means that we probably constrained our process so much that the developers can't see how they can both meet the process and do their jobs. And that's when we get the friction points between security and development.
Very interesting. I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier on. I think it relates to this as well, around threat modeling. So when I first learned about threat modeling, changed my perspective on how I think about security and so forth. I learned it somewhat later in my dev journey, I think. How do you think threat modeling relates to both developers and ops and the platform, I guess?
The good thing about threat modeling, so when done right, let's start with that. When you refer to threat modeling, we need to talk about Adam Shostak. He was the one coming up at Microsoft with the first threat modeling book for designing for security.
Yeah, I've got that one. It's a great book.
Yeah. So and I think this is kind of also important to kind of go through the basics. He basically distills any approach to threat modeling into 4 questions. What are you building? What can go wrong with it? What can you do about it? And how good of a job have you done? Right. So those are kind of the 4 basic questions of threat modeling. And there's actually just 2 weeks ago a threat modeling manifesto, which Adam Shostak also did. Is something that is making the rounds right now that I would suggest everyone have a read. But it basically still asks these 4 questions at the beginning. In question number 1, the reason why threat modeling became so prevalent and so important into the daily practice, which is it avoids scope creep. The first question is, what are you building? And there has been a problem with the risk analysis processes from a lot of security teams that I've worked with over the years, is that we go in to help a team look at their platform or have a security review of or risk analysis of a particular product or service, and we end up with the laundry list of 150 things that need to be addressed. And what typically happens is product owners and developers are going to look at it and say, I haven't touched that part of the code in ages. I don't know when I'm next going to touch that part of the code. This does not align with anything that I'm building right now. You're basically asking me to stop everything I'm doing and do security. And that's just, you can't convince anyone of that, right? Unless you've had a security incident where the whole organization knows that, yes, we're going to stop and do security for a while. That's the only organizational event that can lead to you having such an affordance of stopping everything and doing that. So because threat modeling practices start with what are you building, you constrain that to the feature being built, to the thing that you're developing right now. In that way, it makes it really simple and easy, and for the product owners, etc., to be inclined to include any security work because you are constraining it to the thing they're already touching. And I think that's a big reason why threat modeling has become so prevalent. I think that's reason number 1. You avoid scope creep if you're doing threat modeling properly. And you can actually integrate into the things that people are doing and it means that you no longer need to think of security as a review that you do at the end. You can think of security as, I'm implementing this function. What threats are in this function that I'm building, right? So what threats am I exposed to? In the companies that do this right, ensure that when you integrate security into a process, it becomes part of your definition of done. So this is a security review and you need to tick this box. Is my definition of done ensures that things have been through threat modeling process, that we've identified whatever we needed to identify. And also, I think a big part of what this means is that you also constrain in time. So you know you're not always going to be in the position to let's do a 3-hour workshop every sprint. That's not going to happen, right? So having methodologies that are going to help you constrain time, knowing that it's built into your methodology, that the highest risk threats are the first ones that you look into, right? Or having a way to go through that, I think is key for long-term threat modeling success.
As you were talking there, I was also thinking about a chat I had a while back with Charity Majors, who's very popular in the observability space, always learn a bunch from Charity. And she was arguing bake observability in early, because a lot of folks, they kind of push stuff and it's, I need to understand what's going on, I'll add some metrics in. I kind of was curious, as you were talking there, how do you think threat modeling security relates to things like observability, being able to understand your system? We should think about that really early on in the dev process, I'm thinking too.
I definitely think that overall in the market, something that is currently not being explored to its fullest potential. So I think that observability tools have a brilliant security potential to be used as real security tools once we start using them better and using them specifically for security. I think there's a significant open space in the market for that to be the next generation of security tools based on observability in the data that you already have, right? But that is still, I think, overall not very much explored. And that's a big problem in the industry overall, is that we are still thinking about security as an add-on vendor that you're going to add, and we're not really thinking about how the technologies that Dev and Platform are already using give you the observability we need if you can add the intelligence of understanding what are the implications to security. And I also think that's kind of where the market is going. We are no longer going to add this tool or this product to make you secure. You know that the IT tools that you're using are going to tell you how secure you are. Right? And I think that's the direction of travel. But overall, from an observability point of view, observability is an interesting term overall because there's kind of the technical understanding of observability, which is more about the instrumentation of code and making sure that you understand what's happening with your application. There's also the socio-technicity lens, so that people such as Jay Bloom talk a lot about. So socio-technicity of DevOps is a talk that I would suggest everyone to have a look. And I think that the Jabe's approach to observability, or how he talks about it, is most useful for security because it breaks down observability into different time spans, into agency of the actors. So, for instance, what I mean by that is if you are a developer or a security engineer, the agency you have to perform actions in your CI/CD platform, in developing anything that you're doing, are usually going to be constrained within sprints. So you know that you've done something now, you know at the end of the sprint, you're going to have a definition of done, which your work is going to be measured against. And that's your observability, that's your feedback loop. The challenge with security is that typically we are trying to address risks. And risks don't work in 2-week sprints. That's not how things work, right? Inherent in the idea of risk is the element of uncertainty. So we may make a decision now, and even from the point of view of CTOs and CIOs, not working on the security feature on the next 2 sprints is doing nothing from a risk perspective to them. It's too short of a time frame. It's unlikely you're going to be breaching the next 2 weeks. It may happen, but the way you're looking at your system when you're at the management level is at least in 6-month cycles, usually 2 to 5 years, depending on how you're looking at it. And that's also part of the challenge of justifying security, is that if nothing ever happens for that good money that you spend, because there's that element of uncertainty. Obviously, things are getting different because of regulatory compliance, contractual requirements, and all of that, things that we need to evidence. But on the grounds of uncertainty and risk alone, it may or may not happen. And having that observability between on not making a call today that you won't see the results of that in another 2 to 3 years' time is part of the challenge of security.
I know you mentioned it a couple of times around the technologies and the socio-technical system and the processes. Have you got any good thinking tools that you could share with folks? Off mic, you and I were chatting around Wardley mapping and Cynefin, both things I'm fascinated around. Would you recommend folks look into those kind of models for helping them understand the value of security?
Yeah, for sure. Not just understanding the value of security, but also understanding how the system, and when I say system, I'm talking about organization, I'm not talking about an IT system. How the systems that they're involved in evolve and how things that happen outside of your system affect it. So I think both Wordle mapping and Cynefin are great ways to look at it. Another thing that I've also blogged about in my blog, and I'm planning a few more posts in the next few weeks, is on social practice theory. The typical way to look at security has been people, process, and technology. That's usually what people talk about. It's not a problematic lens, but I think the lens of social practice theory is more helpful, which looks at organizational practices from the point of view of meanings, know-how, and materials. So materials being artifacts, meanings being why do I do this? A lot of security way of thinking is kind of caught up in Taylorism, right? We think a lot about our processes, our mechanics, our machine, and we just want to improve the machine, right? But people aren't machines, right? I think some of the lenses that we use, such as people process technology, such as CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, are kind of old world lens. They're still applicable, they're still relevant. So from a practice perspective, a social practice theory of meanings, know-hows, and artifacts. From a CIA perspective, the lens that Sonil Yu writes about from the point of view of distributed, immutable, and ephemeral, right? DIE. I think those are lenses that are more aligned to our current understanding of what a socio-technical system is. This is something that wasn't really talked about much or applied to technology 10 years ago, but now it is. If we're still doing security like we were doing 10 years ago, there's a lot of learnings that we still haven't had that we need to have. And also from a CIA perspective versus DIE, right? Distributed, ephemeral, and immutable. So again, it's not necessarily anything wrong with the old models. It's just that the words we use to describe the old models lead to the old practices that are no longer so useful or so integrated into the modern way of doing things.
Final topic, Emma, I just want to get your brief thoughts on things like red teaming. And I see a lot of folks sort of blending chaos engineering with security now, security testing. Any experience or thoughts on the value? Kind of, you are bringing, I guess, the social side of things into the technical sphere, running game days, running fire drills, seeing what happens when a security incident pops up and how the system deals with it, both from a technical point of view and a social point of view as well. Any thoughts on that?
It is an integral part of the journey towards the focus on resilience. I think a big part of the problem that we've dealt with in security is that the language of control has the problem that it focuses on robustness. So, giving you an example, when we think about floods, a lot of people think about dams. And there's nothing wrong with the dam. They're very useful. They're used throughout the world. The problem with the dam is that it's a robust control. And the inherent problem with robust controls is that once the design conditions are exceeded, they're going to fail catastrophically. Nothing wrong with it. It's just that if that's the only tool you've got on your bag, it will eventually fail, right? Once the design conditions are exceeded, it's going to fail. You can think of it from a salt marsh perspective, that you get water, but it gets inundated and gets absorbed by the bottom, so you only get the additional over top. So when it fails, it does not fail catastrophically. That's a resilient approach to the same problem. And I think part of the direction of travel in security is things like game days, like red teaming, etc., allow us the possibility in a relatively safe environment to understand how our controls act under certain conditions that we are stress testing them under. And that allows us, if we're doing it right, to get all of the organizational learnings. And it's not just about improving the robustness of the controls, which is part of the problem in how many people talk about chaos engineering, is that identifying a problem and either increasing capacity or putting a control to do it. What I am more interested in, what resilience is more interested in, is when we were having the problem, how were the teams talking about it? What did they see that they didn't expect to see? What were they first thinking about what would be the right solution or what the problem was? Because that goes into the heart of resilience, is something that happens at the individual and organizational level. It's not a thing that technology does, right? Technology is not resilient. It's the people that absorb the variability that your systems can't deal with. Right? And when anything goes wrong, you get people on call, and it's the people that are responding to the system. That's when your technology is no longer sufficient. You need the buffer, the human knowledge, and the human capacity to deal with that. And while I do think that chaos engineering, etc., is going in the right direction, I think as an industry, we still need to learn how to tap into the human side of it so that our people also get the benefits from the adaptive capacity and the learnings that they can take from those. So I think we should be focusing more on the people and also on the technology, but it's not technology that's going to save us, right? It's people understanding how their systems fail.
I think the answer to that final question, Mario, is like a whole new podcast, right? Because I'm fascinated by this. I love John Allspor's work, Nora Jones doing a lot of fascinating stuff in this space. And I 100% agree with what you're saying. Looking at what we've learned from the aerospace industry, for example, and airplane crashes, we don't really do all that for our systems. But that's definitely a topic for another day, I reckon, because that is a huge topic. And I'm sure you would have super interesting thoughts on that. At this point, Mario, I say really appreciate your time today. Lots of great stuff. I'll be sure to link a bunch of these things in the show notes. If folks want to get in contact with you, what's the best way? Twitter, LinkedIn?
I'm more active on Twitter than anything else. So Matt Platt, M-A-D Platt on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn, Mario.Platt, I believe, but I'm less active overall.
Super. Well, thanks for your time today, Mario.
Thank you very much for having me.